Hi, my name is Noah Gift, and we're going to cover a really exciting new topic that cropped up in 2021, which is AWS's App Runner. What the App Runner does is it simplifies some core services on the AWS platform, including CloudWatch, load balancers, container management systems, also secure API gateways. It ties all that in and puts it into a package where you can point it to, let's say, a GitHub source repository, or you can point it to where a container lives. It grabs in all that information, builds it out, deploys it to an application. And even further, also continuous delivery is already set up, which is one of the most exciting aspects of Azure App Runner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you two different applications that we can get working using Azure App Runner. First, I'm going to deploy a very simple kind of hello world, a greedy change algorithm. It gives you the correct change through a URL. And then the second thing I'm going to deploy is an MLOps based application. So in the book, Practical MLOps, I have a Python Practical MLOps cookbook. And inside that Python Practical MLOps cookbook, I'm going to show how you can take a machine learning application, put it into AWS App Runner, then take that and do continuous delivery so that every single time you make a change to a source code repository, your machine learning application is put into production. So this is probably one of the simplest ways, if you're interested in doing MLOps, to get started and immediately start getting the benefits of DevOps principles and applying them to machine learning. So let's go ahead and get started. And by the end, you'll be able to deploy your own machine learning application on the AWS platform. Okay, what is AWS App Runner here? Well, let's take a look. This application runner allows you to add a source. So you can go to GitHub, you can also go to a container, and you can select it and use that as really the source of truth for your application. Automatically, then you can go to configure a build and service setting. You can go to configure your container's number of CPUs, memory, also auto scaling options, and then also a health check. Finally, you can go through, just double check everything's working properly. And then this is really the beauty, is that you can get a secure URL at the very end. So if you're wanting to do, for example, microservices, you want to do MLOps, this is really a powerful new way to deploy AWS applications into production. So let's go ahead and get started here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with logging into the terminal, and I'm going to look at this AWS App Runner terminal here and show you that I've got two separate app runners running. The first one is this one called CAAS here. And look, if I go to this URL, you can see that there's a running application here. And notice that it says something that's pretty interesting here. It says, hey, if I want to make some change, I can go to this route. So let's go ahead and practice that. If I go through here and I type in change, notice the URL parameters here are set up that allow me to make changes. And so I'm going to move my browser a little bit lower here so you can see these URL parameters. And then what I'm going to do is actually show you that what we can do here is put in $1 and let's say 34 cents. This goes through and it gives me back the correct change. And if I want to change it to another amount, let's say, 39 cents and $11, right? We've got 45 quarters, 1 dime and 4 pennies, right? So this is a microservice that is able to be fully directional and allow me to actually go through and make changes to it. Now notice if we go back here, and if I click on this service, it gives me a little bit more information about the service. So we've got a default domain set up, and we also have a link to the source. So let's go ahead and take a look at that source. And notice here that this is an application that I was previously using for Elastic Beanstalk. Also, I've used the same application for what I would call a container as a service, which is Fargate. And so really all we need to do here is look at this application and notice that it's a pretty small Flask application. We import Flask. I go through here and I make the correct amount of change. And that's really the core logic of the application. And then I just need to create a route here. I create a hello world, which I think is a very good idea when you're playing around with things, is to make sure you have a hello world application route so that you can test things. And then the more complex route does, again, what we just showed is it correctly makes the change. It shows us the dollar parameter and the cents parameter here. And then notice that it's running on port 8080. So really, this is the first application that we're going to go ahead and get running locally. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do it again. So let's go back into this app runner here, and we'll go through and we'll say create service. Notice that it gives us the ability to go to source and deployment. I could pick a container registry. That's one option, and it could be either the private Amazon Container Registry or the public Amazon Container Registry, which is really useful because if I was going to deploy something maybe internal to my company, this could be an important option. Now, the second thing that I can do is I don't have to just have a container. I could also click source code repository, and I've already hooked up my GitHub into there, and we can just toggle through and look for a particular repository that I want to deploy in this manner. And so I'm going to type in here and say EKS Fargate tutorial, which I've kind of hijacked here. And then notice that there's actually a couple different options to do deployment. There's manual, which I think is probably the best way to start out with, which allows you to manually deploy it either from the console, like we're doing now, or a command line tool, or automatic. Now, automatic has the advantage of every time I make a change to the application, it auto deploys. Let's go ahead and pick automatic here, and we'll go ahead and say next. Now from here, you have two options. You can either deploy all your settings inside of the build server, or you can use a configuration file. For a more mature project, I think it's probably a good idea to use a YAML file. For now, though, what we're going to do is we're going to do it all manually in the console. I'm going to pick Python 3, and then it's going to say, okay, well, how do I deploy my application? Now, because I've already got this set up here, I have some commands that are easy to look at in terms of the makefile. I can just copy this command here, and I can go back over to my console and just paste that in. So I'm going to do a pip install, which will install the software that I need for my application. And then it's going to ask for a start command. So again, we know that in the previous example here that this application is going to be running Flask, and Flask I can just say Python app.py. So we'll go ahead and do that. We'll say Python app.py. And then for the port, again, it would need to correspond to what this says here, which is port 8080. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in. So port 8080. There we go. And now I'll go to next, and it'll say what's the service name. We can just call this change app, like that. Call whatever it needs to be, the specifications here. And then here's where I could actually go through and choose higher options. If I had, let's say, a lot of memory that I was using in this application, I could also do environmental variables if I needed to, let's say, talk to a database or some other resource and kind of swap it out. I also can have auto scale capabilities as well. So this in particular can handle 100 simultaneous requests. And then what it'll do is actually it could spin up to 100 requests per all the way up to 25 instances, right? So it could go up to 2,500 simultaneous requests. Also here, this is really a powerful feature, is that this app runner itself will allow you to have the ability to do a health check, which it'll let us know if there's a problem. And finally, there's security, where I could actually have an IAM role associated with it. Okay, now that we've looked through those options, I'm going to leave it all by default because I don't need to do anything in terms of changing the defaults. I'm going to go through here to review, just make sure that I've got everything set up here. And then once I do this next section, it'll deploy the application. So let's go ahead and do this. And what'll happen is while it's deploying, it'll take, let's say, 5 minutes or so. We can look at, in fact, the logs, and it will show us step by step what it's doing, which is great because if I was going to deploy this to a virtual machine, I would need to maybe shell into the machine, take a look at everything that's happening. But this really lets us see things step by step. And you can see here, service creation is set to operation in progress. Here's the service creations that started. And then if you go through here as well, it'll show us both the application log and the deployment log. So what we can do is just let this thing go through, and then when it's done, what I'll be able to do is go again back to here, and this status will change to a finished status. Okay, now while this thing is being deployed, let me show you one of the best ways that I would recommend to test this thing out, and that's using the AWS Cloud Shell. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. I'm going to open up a new tab here, and what we can do is when I open up this new tab, it'll again take maybe 30 seconds or so. I can actually interact with different parts of my application. I can change it, and I can even trigger continuous delivery operations if I've got that continuous delivery option set up. So that's one of the great things about this Cloud Shell environment, is that it's a way where I can both control things inside of the AWS ecosystem, and I also can go through and trigger operations to deploy my code. Okay, so now that I've got this terminal set up here, one of the things that I think is a great use case for this terminal is to actually curl an existing maybe application that's been deployed and make sure that it's working properly. So if we can go back here again, we see this, there's the app runner, we add the source, we do the configuration, we review it, and then we get a secure URL. So we can actually both change it inside of here. That's one thing we can do, and we can also receive that secure URL. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to that other application that I already had running, right? Because we know that that is basically the mimic of this one. And notice if I click on it, I can actually just copy that URL here, and I can go back to my Cloud Shell environment, and I can actually do a curl. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's say a curl here, paste that in, and notice it says, hey, I can make change at this route. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. Change route, we'll say change 134. There we go, and I can test it out. So this is one of the most useful aspects of the Cloud Shell in combination with the Azure App Runner, is it allows us to really verify that everything's working. All right, let's go back here. We can go to this service. Now we see that it's running. Look, it says status running. And if we click on it, we have a new domain here. And what we can do is also look at the event log. It says created service, it's successful. This is when the start time was. And so again, I can go back here and either click on the browser, open it up, and that will actually show me that this is working. I can go through here and do, change $1.34. Perfect. Or we can go what we did before here with this new change app, and I can copy it, and then I can actually test it out in this browser-based environment. Again, go through here, curl it, go through, add that parameter, change 134, right? So this is a great feedback loop to be able to use the terminal, do things like administer AWS, test out services, but then also use the console to rapidly develop things. So now that we've got this set up, can we also test out whether the continuous delivery service works? And what are a couple ways we can do this? Well, one of the ways we can test this out is if I go back to this repo, I'm going to go to code here. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to just do a git clone. So I've already created SSH keys here and then put those into GitHub. And so if I type in git clone, paste this in, I now have access to this repo. I'm going to cd into this EKS repo here. And then what I'm going to do is just make a very small change to a README file. So I'm going to use Vim and open this up. And I'm going to add a little note here that says, maybe, here we go, verified deploy with AWS App Runner. Okay, let's go ahead and save this. And we'll say get status, add this in. We'll say get add README, get commit. Let's go ahead and add this, adding changes. And now what we can do is we can configure this if you want to. Not a bad idea. I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to say noah.gift at gmail.com. Let's go ahead and do that. And then I'm going to do this last thing, which is I'm going to put my name in there. This is a one-time thing that you have to do the first time you use GitHub, Git on a new environment. And then we can go here and just actually say git push, and that's going to go ahead and make that change. And we can again go here and say get status. I forgot to do the commit here, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's say commit, and then we can do the get push. There we go. So now we know we're making the change. And what'll happen is that first, let's verify that that change is inside of here. Look, we just see that those changes were made, right? This is that comment. And then if I go back to this environment, look, it already triggered the deployment because we told it to listen to changes in GitHub. So this is really powerful because it allows us to do continuous delivery. And continuous delivery means that my code is always in a deliverable state and it's ready to deploy those changes here. And again, now it's going to go through and do a new deployment. So if this was a new, maybe a new route, or some new functionality to the application, this would go through and automatically deploy those changes. So there's a lot to like about this Azure App Service. Now that that's a basic microservice here, let's move on to a more complex one next. Let's take a look at Python MLOps Cookbook. This is something that's part of some recipes that I've triggered for the Practical MLOps book, which is by O'Reilly, Operationalizing Machine Learning into Production. And what we're going to do is take a look at this general structure here. So, you can actually pull a container, right? That's one thing we could do, and we could actually test out a lot of this code. We also could run it locally in an environment. There's a different list of files here. These are all the assets. I have a make file, I have a requirements file, I have a command line interface, I have a utilities file, an application file. There's a lot of code in here, but basically the key components are the app, which is still relatively simple. We use Flask. I follow my own advice. I always make sure there's a hello world route here. And then I have a prediction route that all this does is it calls a library that allows me to predict what someone's height is from their weight. So it's an intentionally very simple machine learning application. And you can see here, this is how it works, is very similar to the previous application. We have GitHub, we trigger a change, and then that change goes through and it is able to deploy to some target like Fargate or Azure App Services. And in particular, you can see here that I can also test it out locally in the command line. And what we're going to do is we're going to deploy this machine learning application into production from scratch and test it out and see how simple it is to also make changes and deploy things to production with with AWS App Runner. So let's go ahead and take a look here first at this console. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out of this other directory and I'm going to look inside of this Python MLOps Cookbook. Here we go. And what's nice about this MLOps Cookbook is that I've also given you the ability to run things locally. So if I wanted to, for example, just test it out, we could do this, and you can see that it runs locally in this shell, right? And I could, kind of play around with it and do things with it locally. Also, I have a utility, which we're going to use in a little bit, that will actually allow me to test out a running production system. So if we go through here and we say utils -- help here, notice that it has some options. It says one of the things that it can do is it can do a prediction. Okay, let's go ahead and do that, and let's do a help message for it. So we'll say predict, and notice that it gives me the options of changing who the host is, also allowing me to put in the weight, and then once I have those options, I can actually do a prediction to production. So again, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say predict, and we'll say host, and I can go back to a previous application here. Let's go. We have this running here, and I'm going to select it, and notice this is the URL, and so I'm going to go ahead and copy that URL here, and I'm going to paste it inside as the host, and I'm going to add predict to it, right? So I've already written some code that lets me test any endpoint, often a good idea if you're deploying a machine learning application. And then I'm going to add in the weight, and let's go ahead and put 300 pounds. What would my height be if I was a typical Major League Baseball player that was 300 pounds? Here we go. We got a response from this MLOps endpoint, and it says that you probably would be 6'8". What happens if we have maybe someone that's 150 pounds? Maybe they're the you shortstop, we go through here and we run it in, and it says that typical 150 pounder would be 5'11" in Major League Baseball. So we've got a full endpoint here that allows us to really test a machine learning application. And really the last thing I'll do real quick is just show you how I deploy this application. Again, it's just as simple. If we go back to this code here and we look at all the assets here, really the main things that are important are there's a model that I trained earlier, there's the Flask application here, and then there's this command line tool, which again, all it does is make a request to my deployed endpoint. So really there's not a lot of code that I need to get things running. And then there's also a requirements file that has the specific versions of packages. So we can use the same pattern to deploy any kind of machine learning application. Let me just show you really quick how to set that up. So we'll go through here, and again, we'll go to sign into the console, get into our AWS App Runner, and I'm gonna go ahead and create a new service. And again, I could choose a container registry if I had pushed it to the Amazon Container Registry. I'm gonna select the source code repo. I'm gonna go through here and I'm gonna find that MLOps cookbook. There we go. Let's go through here, MLOps. There we go, Python MLOps cookbook. And then from here, I'm gonna select, again, either manual or automatic. Let's just use manual for this time. And then I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna select Python 3, build command. It's gonna do the same thing. It's gonna be pip install -r requirements .txt. And then the start command will be identical again, because it's just a simple Flask application, Python app.py. And then again, I can just look at the application to double check what port it's running. It looks like it wants port 8080. So we'll go back here and we'll do port 8080, put that in. And really that's the hardest part of the application, is just pointing it to an application that you've already tested out locally and that it runs. Again, you just call it a new service. We'll call this MLOps demo, like this. And we'll go ahead and say next. It will go through here and it will deploy this service. Again, it takes just a few minutes to deploy it, and I can do everything that I did before. So let's go ahead and summarize next everything that we did and why it's really a powerful feature for deploying machine learning applications into production. Okay, so why is AWS App Runner so exciting? Well, one of the reasons it's so exciting is it allows us to take something that is pre-built, you've tested it out, maybe it's a microservice, it's got some machine learning components to it, and really point it quickly to a repo and deploy that into production so that you can focus on other things other than just the operation of the machine learning application and the machine learning model. That's one of the things that's really an emerging property of all the interest in MLOps, is that people want to focus on really giving a solution to the customer, right? How do you solve a problem? And if there's a high-level service like AWS App Runner and the machine learning application has really been solved maybe through AutoML, or you've intentionally created a small application, then really there's only a couple other things to focus on. Maybe you want to get your data pipeline working, and then also focus on, does the customer themselves like this model? Does it add value, add revenue? And so in a nutshell, a lot of MLOps, and I cover this in the O'Reilly book, is about simplifying things and automating things. And that's really one of the features of this AWS App Runner.